Right now, though, John Tillman from Illinois Policy. Find out more at illinoispolicy.org. And John with us right now to talk about a couple of things, including this AFSCME bill that, it might be a veto override. We'll have to see about that. The process started yesterday. John, good morning to you.
Good morning. Great to be with you.
I appreciate the time this morning. This is happening, now. Senate voting yesterday on this union bill. The House is going to vote soon. Senate did override the governor's veto. Let's start with the basics there. This is a bill that would say no strikes and no lockouts, but the catch is the arbitration portion here, which could be extremely costly for Illinois taxpayers.
Yeah, so the arbitrators traditionally have long sided with the unions, and so theoretically the way an arbitration works is each side comes to the table, presents their point of view, and the arbitrator concludes what is a fair compromise between the two. The tradition, though, however, is arbitrators tend to be an inside player, and almost always there's just hundreds and hundreds of examples of this around the country where the arbitrator sides with the unions. And the reason this is very dangerous for the taxpayers is the state is already $4 billion overspending, more spending scheduled with the Democrat-passed bill, $36 billion versus the $32 billion of revenue. And this, over 4 years, would add $1.6 billion to that deficit and give another 11% pay increase to AFSCME workers. And I should just give you context on that. Over the previous 10 years, after inflation, they've gotten a 32% increase, when the taxpayers of the state and the private sector who pay for those salaries have only gotten a 14% increase in the private sector. So this is very unfair and frankly unaffordable. And so this arbitration bill is very, very important because at present, the governor is the one who would negotiate with the unions rather than an arbitrator. And the governor's job is to represent the taxpayers.
And John, if it were to go to an arbitrator under the bill, he or she would have to choose one side or the other. It could not come up with something in the middle between the two proposals. Is that correct?
I'm not sure that's correct. I believe it varies.
I thought I had read that, but
It varies by arbitrator and state, and my understanding is it's not an all or nothing. That is true in many arbitrations where it's all or nothing, but I'm not sure that's true here. So that would be even more dangerous. But I think what's really interesting about this is what the Democrats have done is they have said the number one priority for us remains government workers instead of the taxpayers who fund the government. And what we have been advocating, and certainly Governor Rauner has been advocating, is we want to have a balanced solution between the taxpayers' interest, who pay for everything, and the government workers who provide services for the state. And what this does is takes that negotiating process out. So the next step in this process is it's going to move over to the House. And the House has 15 days to take this up. It takes 48 votes in the House to sustain the governor's veto and protect the taxpayers. If they don't get those 48 votes, then they'll have an override, and this will become law. So if you care about this issue, you need to let your House members know that you want them to sustain this veto.
And in the House, John, Michael Madigan, according to the Tribune, pledging he has the votes to overturn the veto. That would mean he'd have to hold together all of his Democrats, all 71 Democrats, or peel off a Republican vote or two. You know, among those Democrats, if people are making phone calls, someone who sometimes is not in that 71 is right near us. State Rep Jack Franks occasionally is not with the Democrat majority. He might be one of those key votes in the House.
He's a very key vote, and frankly, Jack Franks has long been a pretty good voter for taxpayers. He often goes against Speaker Madigan's interest. He generally wins a comfortable margin in a district that otherwise is overwhelmingly Republican. His district voted overwhelmingly for Governor Rauner. His district voted overwhelmingly for Mitt Romney in the 2012 presidential election. So if he votes with the Democrats on this one, he's going to be voting against his district's interest. And I think for the first time in a long time, though it looks like he could be very tough to beat, he will start to have some challenges. And I think there will be a tremendous amount of money to fund that challenge. And for the first time in a long time, I think Jack Franks will have his political life at risk. And he's not alone. There are others, Carol Senti up in the North Shore of Chicago, Scott Drury, Kate Clunan, Stephanie Kiefowit. These are all people in very, very close races that will be at risk in the 2016 election. And I can tell you that if from the conversations I've had on and off the record, that if this veto is overridden, there will be a price to pay come 2016.
John Tillman with us from Illinois Policy. IllinoisPolicy.org is the website. Riley and Scott on WROK. And this bill, too, is temporary, right, John? It only goes through the Rauner administration. The unions, of course, thinking that they can return a Democrat to power and then sit across the bargaining table from someone they poured millions of dollars into a campaign to elect, thus get friendlier terms.
This is how cynical Speaker Madigan and his compatriots in the House and Senate President John Cullerton are, both Chicago Democrats, is they are so beholden and so loyal to the unions that they changed the law that had existed previously where governors were the primary negotiator. They were fine when it was Republican governors who kind of went along with the system. They were fine with it when there were Democrat governors who maybe weren't all that competent, but at least did the bidding of the Speaker. And now that they have a guy who actually wants to put the taxpayers and the poor and disadvantaged at the front of the line and have a seat at the negotiating table, they don't want any part of that. So they pass a 4-year temporary bill that reverts. And if you want to know how cynical and how much this is all about your political insider loyalty, remember the vast majority of union money goes to Democrats, about 71%, overwhelmingly. There was one Republican last night in the Senate, Sam McCann,
yes,
who voted for this bill, and I think he will very likely, and these, by the way, are my personal opinions and not the Institute's opinions, he will very likely, I'm sure, have a primary challenge.
I know people are going to make a lot about the fact that one Republican was peeled off in the Senate, Sam McCann, John, but again, from the personal political side, not from the policy side. Sam McCann is a guy who was encouraged by unions to run a third-party gubernatorial race in 2012 to torpedo, or not 2012, but the last election to torpedo Bruce Rauner. He was being encouraged by unions to do so. I kind of wonder whether this was a small bit of an I'm sorry, I apologize on Sam McCann's behalf to AFSCME.
Yeah, I think it probably was. And another way to look at it, it was a flying finger to taxpayers in his district who voted for Governor Rauner. Remember, they all voted for Governor Rauner in his district, and I think Sam McCann is about to have a very interesting whirlwind of experience between now and 2016.
And again, why this is so important, John, you elected governor, and almost 2 million people voted for Governor Rauner, I think the final total was, to do things like this, to negotiate contracts, to represent taxpayers in these negotiations. This bill would do everything to encourage AFSCME and other unions not to come to the table, not to be willing to compromise, but to simply say, you know what, don't worry about it. We're just going to go to arbitration and let someone else decide, not the person that taxpayers and voters have decided to put in that position of power.
Yeah, and here's why all of this is important. First of all, I think it's just really sad because what this continues to do is drive a wedge between taxpayers who fund all government at every level, taxpayers who fund all charitable work in the state, who work in the private sector. They feel they're not getting a fair deal, and that's why we are leading the country at the rate at which people abandon our state to go to neighboring states. The most recent year we have is we've lost population to every single other Midwest state. So this is not about weather. This is about opportunity and where you feel like you're being treated fairly. And I mentioned earlier that the government workers have had a 32% after inflation increase. The average is now $82,000 a year, up from $62,000. Whereas in the private sector, that same period of time, the average household wage has gone from $57,000 to $65,000. So you have people paying for those huge wages, and the government workers make more, and now they want more at a time of fiscal crisis and are not willing to sacrifice. I think it's an outrage.
John Tillman with us from the Illinois Policy Institute. He's CEO. IllinoisPolicy.org is the website. Riley and Scott on WROK. I want to hit a couple of things, too, before we let you go, John. One, I saw a survey released yesterday. About a third of Illinois union households are unaware they can opt out of union membership. Now, there's no right to work law, so you have to pay fees or dues, but there's some recourse that union households have if they don't want to. But about a third don't even know they have that recourse?
That's exactly right. And so what we're trying to do is help union members understand what their rights are. Not every union member, unions are not monolithic. Not everybody agrees. And you put in a good large group of people together, and there's about 831,000 unionized workers in Illinois. Some of them are conservatives. Some of them are liberals. Some of them are independent and everything in between. And the evolution of labor law over the last few years has been very important, and not just in the states but federally, to try to provide more rights to workers so they know their rights and know whether they can have to be in the union or not. And the whole point here is you should not have to join a union to be employed. And what we like to point out is what we're talking about here is empowering workers. In fact, this week happens to be National Employee Freedom Week. And if you think back on the whole labor relationship between workers and management or ownership, in the 1800s, there was no question, as the economy was sort of figuring itself out, and we developed from a raw agrarian economy to where we are through the 19th century, the 1800s, labor really was necessary to try to start creating equity and right those wrongs. In the 20th century, labor became all-powerful. But by the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, labor just dominated. As we get into the 21st century, we have to modernize our labor law now. Workers have so many more rights, are protected by so many more regulations that give them rights. And what the labor union construct does is take those rights away and give it to the union heads and the unions themselves. What we're saying is those rights should devolve to the individual worker. They should be able to choose.
John Tillman with us, Illinois Policy, IllinoisPolicy.org. On union negotiations, I had a question on that because here in Rockford, the school district, Rockford District 205, and the teachers just came to a new contract agreement. Everything done in secret, behind closed doors. Taxpayers who foot the bill didn't get a chance to see any details in this proposal until all was said and done, locked in stone, was unable to be changed. Then we see details like even though Rockford paid the most penalties in the state for these late career salary spikes for educators, there's no promise to eliminate them. There was only a commitment to discuss ways to avoid penalties in this contract. So anyway, the question I have, what's the law on this, or what's the policy? Why are these negotiations done behind closed doors? Why can't taxpayers see what's being voted on before it's voted on? Is that a law? Is that a policy from district to district? What gives?
It's the way state labor law works, is that they're allowed to have these negotiations in secret. And, of course, that state labor law was written by the Democrats, who are funded by the unions, and supported in part by union-funded Republicans as well. And so they want to be able to negotiate behind closed doors and then provide taxpayers who have to fund that contract with a fait accompli. It's all done, nothing to see here, just go about your business and keep paying your taxes and shut up. And this is, I think, again, we've been working for many, many years to try to pass a bill that would require transparency in the contract negotiations. This should all be out in the open. And in fact, not only should it all be out in the open, it should be out in the open and then publicly available for a period of time before the governing body, the school board of trustees, for example, can vote on these agreements. What happens right now, and people always ask me, why does this happen? Why do the unions get such great control, and why do these things spin out of control? For example, in your Rockford contract, they're going to get a 2% raise for the coming school year, a 1% raise for the following year. Mm-hmm. That's going to be paid for by your taxpayers. Meanwhile, on the health care side, the average teacher is paying about 15%. That's 15% of their health care premiums. I guarantee you that every one of your listeners is paying on average between 40 and 70% of their health care premiums. Some of them are paying as little as $27 a month. Remember, that subsidy, that benefit is being picked up by your property taxes. Mm-hmm. When you wonder why your property taxes are skyrocketing, this is why. The vast majority of your property tax goes to a contract. But the dirty little game they don't want you to know is what happens is the superintendent of the school district is the primary negotiator with the unions. But what happens over time is the superintendent actually becomes an ally of the teachers and the unions and does not have a full adversarial relationship. Meanwhile, the voluntary school boards who run that district, who ultimately have to sanction these contracts, become captured by the professional superintendent and his staff. All their information is provided to them. All their legal advice is provided by insiders. So the boards of directors of the, if you will, boards of trustees of these school districts really don't have full information. And in fact, many of them are sometimes teachers or teacher allies. So you have this incestuous relationship where essentially the union is on both sides of the bargaining table, and that's why deals are passed like this, where there's no arm's length transaction, except, you know who's not at the table? The taxpayers and the children who are being poorly educated.
John Tillman, Illinois Policy, IllinoisPolicy.org is the website.
Thanks so much. Have a great day.